The advantage of using a server-side programming language like PHP for developing internet-based applications is that PHP has complete access to the resources on the server. Those resources include the file system. And not only can we read and write files easily with PHP, we can do other manipulations of the file. We're going to focus on reading and writing the files on the server using PHP. Well, before we can read a file, we need to create what's referred to as a handle to the file. To do that, we call the fopen function, and we pass it the fully qualified path to the file and identify to the function fopen what mode we want to use for reading the file. We can use R for just reading from the beginning of the file sequentially, or we can use R+, which tells the fopen function to open the file for reading and writing. Now, how much data is in the file? We can get that information by using the file size function. This function returns the number of bytes in the file. Now, if we want to read the entire file, or if we want to read just a limited number of bytes from the file, we can use fread. The fread function takes the file handle and some number of bytes and returns the contents of the file to us. When we're done with a file, the best practice is to call fclose on the file handle to release those resources. Now, this isn't absolutely required because PHP will close all open files when the application terminates. However, it is best practice. Now, how else can we read data from a file? There's a function fgets that will read a single line of data from a file. And then even further, we can use fgets to read only part of a single line from the file by specifying in the function call the number of bytes to read. Now, depending on the content of the data, we could use function fgetss will strip the HTML and PHP tags from the input data as it's read. Another very useful function, fgetcsv, will read a comma-separated file directly into an array for us. Now, if we're reading sequentially from a file, we need to know where the file ends to be able to control the iterations through the file. We can do that with the feof function. This is the end of file function. The feof function will return true when we reach the end of the file. So we can use this function as a loop control variable to continue reading a file until we get to the end of the file. And if we want to move around within the data in the file, we can use fseek. Fseek changes our position within the file. Now, writing to a file is no more difficult than reading. Again, we need to create a handle to the file, and we do this by passing a fully qualified file path and then specifying the mode with which to open that file. And we have four choices for writing to a file. We have W, W+, A, and A+. The difference being that the W and W+ overwrites any existing file contents, while the A and A+ append to the end of an existing file. When we want to write to the file, we call fwrite. We pass the handle and we pass the data that we want to write to the file. And again, not required, however, a good practice is to always call fclose when we're done with a file. So let's go look at some code. Our first code snippet is going to demonstrate how to read data from a file. The first step in doing this, on line 13, is to define the fully qualified path to the file we want to read. I assign this fully qualified path to the variable file name. Notice that I'm using single quotes. I do this because I do not want to have to escape the special characters that are embedded within the string. And the single quotes, recall, pass the string as is without interpretation by the PHP preprocessor. The next step on line 14 is to call the open function passing the fully qualified path to the file and the mode that we want to use to open the file. In this case, I want to just read the file, so I pass an R for the mode. fopen will return a file handle. I store that file handle in the variable file. On line 15, I test the variable file to ensure that a valid file handle was returned by the fopen function call. If fopen cannot open the file and create a file handle, it returns false. So I can test for that error and deal with it here inside of the if block. On line 20, I call file size, passing again the fully qualified path to the file, and file size returns the number of bytes of data in the file, which I assign to a variable file size. Then I make the call to fread, and fread will read from a file the number of bytes specified. In this case, I say, from this file, read the entire contents. File size represents the total number of bytes in the file, and I want to read them all. I assign the return from fread, which is the data from the file, into a variable file text. And then I call fclose on the file handle, which releases the resources back to the system. On line 25 and 26, I echo the values that I've read from the file. So let's run this. I will reload the page, and we see we have a file with 310 bytes of data and the values as listed here. Now notice that the values are comma separated. Title of the movie, comma, director. This is important for the next code snippet we're going to look at, which uses the fgetCSV function. On line 13, we're doing the same thing, defining the fully qualified path of the file and assigning that to the file name variable. On line 14, we're opening the file, passing the fully qualified file name, and setting the mode to read. The R sets the mode to read. Then we test the file handle to ensure that the file was opened successfully. Then on line 21, I set up a loop, a while loop, to iterate over the contents of the file. Now I do that using the end of file function, feof. And feof requires a file handle. So I pass our file variable, which contains the file handle, to the feof function. And I set my while condition to when not end of file. When feof encounters the end of the file, it will return true. Otherwise, it returns false. So I set my condition to not, using the bang operator, not end of file. So as long as feof returns false, then the while loop will continue to iterate over the contents of the file. Within the while code block, I call on line 23 fgetCSV, passing the file handle as an argument. fgetCSV returns one line from the file and parses that line using the comma as a delimiter, and then I assign that value to an array named contents. I set the index of the array using the I variable, and I'm iterating here over a file, so I need to increment the index of the array, and I'm using the shortcut here, the plus sign, so the array index will be automatically incremented each time through this loop. When we reach the end of the file, feof will return true and the loop will terminate. Then on line 25, I print the contents of the array. So let's run this one, and we get our array, and it's an associative array. we get the values of the data contained within the file that we read. So a very useful function, fgetcsv, for parsing comma-separated files. So our next snippet writes to a file. The process is very similar to reading from a file. On line 13, we define the fully qualified path to the file. On line 14, we open the file calling the fopen function. Notice that the mode that I'm using on line 14 is A for opening the file. The A is the augment or amend mode to open a file, as opposed to the W mode, which truncates a file, overwrites the contents of the file. The A mode will add to the end of the file anything that we write to it. Again, I test the return from fopen to ensure that a valid file handle was returned. Then I call on line 20 fwrite. I pass the file handle and the value that I want to write to the file. Now, because we open the file using mode A, this value will be appended to the end of the file. Then I call fclose to release the resources associated with the file handle. Then on line 26, to confirm that the data was written to the file, I again read from the file. This is the same from line 26 to line 39. This is the same code that we just looked at in the previous code snippet. So when we run this, we see that the string "I love all of these movies" was appended to the end of the file.